Aaron, I'm the monitoring officer for South Oxfordshire and Vale of Whitehorse District Councils, and also responsible for looking after code of conduct matters for town and parish councils. So welcome on a rather dark and damp October evening. This training session has been arranged to introduce you to the new model code of conduct which has been adopted across Oxfordshire. Your council may or may not have adopted it thus far, but no matter what, the principles and what I talk about tonight are of equal applicability, even though perhaps in terms of interest, your council might have a slightly different approach if it doesn't adopt the model code. So the purpose of the training really is to update in relation to some of the differences that the new model code has compared to previous codes of conduct that we've had. As I'm presenting, I can only see a few people at the top of my screen. So we don't stand on ceremony in these training sessions. If you want to ask a question, please just holler and I'll pause and speak. I'm not the best at picking up messages from the chat. It kind of puts me off my stride because I'm not good at multitasking. So if we could just do the shout out version and we can answer any questions you have as we go along. So we've still got people joining. I'll just talk through the session aims while people are coming along. We're hoping to break the record from the last time. We had over 100 on the last call, so we're a bit far off that tonight, but never mind. The session is recorded, much the same as the last one, so it'll be available for posterity into the future. So, as I said, this session is intended to give you an update following the adoption of a new model code, just to explain the differences and to provide you with some examples regarding specific requirements of the code. Given that there is quite a sea change really in terms of interests, going to focus a bit more on that than I have in previous sessions at the end of the session. So we have a number of documents which you are. So, could anybody mute, please? So I'm getting some feedback. Good. There we are. In terms of materials, there are a few things that we'll send out to you at the end. So as I said, the session is recorded. We'll send out the slides to your clerks who can disseminate them to your council. And we have a flow chart for interests, which has been provided by the Local Government Association as an accompaniment to the model code that they produced. And that's really useful in terms of following through whether you have an interest or not. There's also a rather lengthy, it kind of grows every time I do these sessions. I tend to troll the media to find examples of breaches of the code of conduct. We haven't got a standards board for England anymore, so basically in terms of English cases, what's reported in the media, what I get to find out about in the legal press. But in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they still have an ombudsman who deals with code of conduct complaints, and certainly in Wales there's an adjudication panel that deal with the very serious matters. So as I go through, I'll be giving you examples, but it's about a 30-page companion document, and you can then read that to see some of the examples I found as I've been looking. Okay, so all public office holders are both servants of the public and stewards of public resources. So Nolan principles, which have been around for quite some time, kind of instilled in all of us, apply to both the both members and officers. So it would also apply to your clerk and any employees of your town and parish council. I don't intend to go through them in any great detail, but the fundamental point is that they should really dictate how we operate in public life. They are there for very good reason, and are intended to protect the public and make sure that there's integrity in our dealings as public servants. So you see there that, generally speaking, they are interrelated, but selflessness, so acting solely in the public interest, objectivity, and objectivity means taking decisions impartially and on merit, and not bringing your own personal views, prejudices, etc., into the decision-making forum. So somebody's got their hand up or not? So what's the purpose of a code of conduct? Well, fundamentally, it's to protect and assist you as councillors, to enable you to model your behaviour and provide a personal check and balance. That's the general gist of it. It should also, sorry, I really need people to mute, please, if you're not asking a question. Thank you. Fundamentally, what we want to make sure is that, looking at a code of conduct, you can see quite clearly what conduct is set out there, which may lead to a sanction against you if you were to breach the code of conduct. So what we wanted to make sure with the model code is it was absolutely clear what were requirements of the code and what were actually guiding principles, and I'll talk a little bit to that in a moment. It's also to maintain public confidence in the role of councillor. That with a published code of conduct, the public can see what standards we expect of ourselves, and if there's any breach of those, then they are quite entitled to make a complaint about the breach. So in terms of the background to the model code of conduct, the LGA model code was released just over, well, almost 2 years ago now. That came from a review by the Committee for Standards in Public Life, which published its findings back in January 2019. There are a number of recommendations which I mentioned in my last training session on this. I've also reproduced them in the companion notes because it's quite interesting to see what they said. Unfortunately, the government, having taken quite some time to respond because of COVID, didn't actually take on very many of the recommendations at all, and I'll talk to some of those as we go through. But one of the recommendations was that there should be a model code of conduct, and the Local Government Association produced that, consulted widely, and as I said, that was published. There is a companion guidance to the Local Government Association model code that is very useful. If I say that the model code in Oxfordshire is based on the LGA model code, but as usual, when you get a number of lawyers in the room, they all wanted to put their stamp on the document, so we have something which is relatively bespoke to Oxfordshire, but all of the monitoring officers agreed it, and as such, it's been rolled out across all tiers of government in local government, rather, in Oxfordshire. In terms of code of conduct breaches, it's unusual to see serious breaches. Thankfully, we do have some pretty serious cases, and you'll see from the notes there are some from the adjudication panel in Wales, some High Court cases which demonstrate particularly bad behaviour on behalf of some councillors. But thankfully, these are isolated incidents. I think in terms of where we get most of our business, Stephen and I, Stephen Corrigan is the Deputy Monitoring Officer. Generally, social media, that seems to have created quite a rich seam of complaints under the Code of Conduct over the last couple of years. But also, I think generally most of our complaints, I have to say, come from town and parish councils. And I think if I'm being honest, it's it's because you work in a very small environment sometimes, and you have a lot of people in the area who know each other very well. And what we find sometimes, particularly where there are differences of opinion with maybe local policy, is that there are 2 or 3 different viewpoints in a council, and they lead to internal conflict, personal conflict, which tends then to result in a code of conduct complaint. And that seems to have been what we've had the majority of, certainly since I've been in post, just over a year. As a result of that, what we did quite early on is we introduced a very clear process for dealing with code of conduct complaints, and we make it clear that we will not deal with complaints which are interpersonal in nature, tit for tat, those sorts of complaints. I take the view that the code of conduct is there to guide our conduct and to prevent serious breaches of the code in terms of perhaps bullying, any allegations of corruption, etc. So in terms of codes of conduct, we should have in large part the same code of conduct now applying across all 3 tiers of local government in Oxfordshire. So if you are a double or twin or triple hatted councillor, then you will know that whichever forum you're working in, the same code of conduct will apply. We have asked all town and parish councillors to take on the model code. A lot of the responses we've had are that majority have, but we haven't got a tally of exactly how many have or have not. Only 1 or 2 have decided not to adopt the code. So when does the code of conduct apply to you? The Localism Act, section 27, states that a local authority must adopt a code dealing with conduct that expected of members and co-opted members of the authority when they are acting in that capacity. So fundamentally, as a matter of the statute, the code of conduct will apply to you when you're acting in your capacity as a member. So it's accepted that this means that a councillor must be acting in official capacity for the code to apply, but it does depend on the particular facts of each case. One thing I would say, and this will resonate with you, is that you are not on duty 24/7. I know the public may not appreciate that when you're queuing in the supermarket or waiting at the cash point. Generally, I think members of the public will assume that as a councillor, you're always on duty and they can speak to you about something whenever they want to. But as far as the code is concerned, you must be acting in an official capacity for it to apply. I will talk a little bit more about other circumstances in a moment. So going back a number of years now, 2006, there was a code of conduct complaint about the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. That went to the High Court. He was found in breach of the code, went to the High Court, and he was arguing that the incident that was complained about, and essentially he had an altercation with an Evening Standard reporter, happened when he was off duty. He'd been to an official function, he was leaving, he got doorstepped by the reporter, who was basically asking him for a response to questions, and the Standards Board found that he was in breach. He appealed to the High Court. High Court found that he wasn't in breach because he was not acting in his official capacity. But what the High Court went on to say is that if a councillor gives the impression that they are acting in an official capacity, then it is possible that the code of conduct will apply. So the judge in the High Court said that it seemed to him that unlawful conduct is not necessarily covered. So the example he gave is if a councillor shoplifts or is guilty of drunken driving, they will not be caught by the code of conduct because they're not acting in their capacity as a councillor. Out of interest, the Welsh model code does say that you could be found to being in disrepute for something you do outside of your role as a councillor. I say that for interest, that's just the situation in Wales, but a slightly different approach. However, what the judge went on to say, as I said just now, is that if you give the impression that you're acting in your official capacity, then you may be caught by the code. And the example he gave is somebody going to a restaurant and wanting to sit at a particular table and then essentially saying something to the restaurateur to the effect of, "Don't you know who I am? I'm a councillor. I'm on the licensing committee. I could cause you problems." That, even though the person was not acting in an official capacity, the code of conduct would apply in those circumstances. And likewise, social media. So I always give advice around social media and say that I never want to give the impression I'm trying to put councillors off social media. Far from it. I think it's a very valuable tool, and in fact, it's the accepted norm these days for communicating with constituents and perhaps your ward. But one of the problems we have is that arguments and issues which could be taking place within the council often spill over into social media, and on the basis that the post is instantaneous and widely spread, then generally it's seen by a lot of people. So I always give the advice that you should have clear demarcation between your social media accounts. So if you have an official account, make sure you just deal with official business on that. Avoid getting into any online disagreements. Perhaps there's somebody who's disgruntled with something that you've said or done in a council meeting on your personal account, because I've had a number of occasions where I found councillors to be in breach of the code of conduct because of something that's happening in on social media. Sorry, I said breach of the code of conduct, that the code of conduct has applied to them. I'll give a couple of examples on the slides. One was a case I dealt with in Stockport, personal Twitter account, but the councillor was a cabinet member and was in effect arguing with a member of the public about something that had happened within her portfolio, so the code of conduct applied to her. There's another case which was a very difficult case, probably one of the most difficult I've ever dealt with, at Stroud, where a councillor had commented on Twitter about a demonstration during the Black Lives Matter protests back at the beginning of the first lockdown. Gosh, seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? But lockdown 1, BC, I think, as they call it these days, isn't it? Before COVID. Essentially, there was a demonstration, and the councillor took issue with the fact that these individuals were demonstrating, and that was on her personal Twitter account, but her Twitter handle was @councillor, etc., etc. So I put the link to the actual letter I wrote as a resolution of that complaint, so you can have a look at that out of interest. In that case, I found that she wasn't in breach of the code of conduct, but the code did apply to her because, as I said, she'd given the impression she was acting as a councillor. Now, I mentioned the Committee for Standards in Public Life. In their report, they essentially recommended that there should be what us lawyers call a rebuttable presumption that a councillor was acting in an official capacity, and it would be for the councillor to demonstrate that they weren't. I wasn't particularly happy with that, apart from the fact it would create a lot of work for all of us. I think that the situation as it is good enough. The government didn't accept that, and what they said is that it's important to recognise that there's a boundary between an elected representative's public life and their private or personal life. Automatically presuming, irrespective of the context and circumstances, that any comment is in an official capacity risks conflating the two. So I think that's the right outcome as far as I'm concerned. So there's not going to be any change to the circumstances in which the code of conduct applies anytime soon. Having said that, I mean, I'm going to state the obvious here, but you should always behave according to the highest standards of personal conduct. And as I've already said, the public don't necessarily understand that, but you are not on duty 24/7, 365 days of the year. So don't you know who I am? Quite a number of examples of that on the companion sheets. It's quite hard to believe sometimes that that councillors can get themselves involved in these sorts of issues, but unfortunately, in isolated instances, they do. So, what type of activity is covered? Well, everything we do really, but all forms of communication and interaction, face-to-face meetings and telephone meetings, online. I mean, this form of communication has become the norm. I don't particularly like doing hybrid training sessions. I much prefer to be in the room with everybody, but that's the way it is. But these days, obviously, with meetings being streamed, it's in the public eye, there's a permanent record, and very often what I find, I have to go back and look at recordings of meetings to see what happened, but there's now a permanent record, whereas before it might have just been something said in a meeting which was not being recorded. So all I would say is that with the advent of hybrid meetings and meetings being streamed, there is a lot more opportunity for complaints to be made. So as I say there, obviously everybody expects us to behave to the highest standards in our public and private life. So just be aware of any activity which might cause embarrassment for your council. I've had a couple of complaints in relation to perhaps neighbour disputes, and they can cause complaints under the Code of Conduct, but we deal with them robustly. One of the issues I was made aware of when I arrived certainly by town and parish clerks was that there was a concern that perhaps complaints and complainants were indulged, shall we say, in terms of Code of Conduct complaints. As I referred earlier on, we now have arrangements in place. They are very robust. So we sift complaints using that process, and we will only take forward those complaints which have evidence on the face of it. We've also adopted a public interest test now, which we didn't have before, and that means that there has to be direct evidence of a breach of the code, and it has to be in the public interest to take it further forward. So just to reassure you, we are not entertaining vexatious complaints. So the way the code is constructed is separated into two parts. You have the start of the code, which are general principles, but as I say, they're equally important. So the Nolan principles are in there. When the code was first drafted, and some of the codes I saw when I arrived in Oxfordshire were quite widely drawn. So the Nolan principles would potentially be capable of forming a breach of the code if you were in breach of the Nolan principles. I've always taken the view that councillors need to have clarity about what could lead to a complaint. So one of the things I insisted upon we have now is a demarcation between principles and obligations. So the obligations, as we call them, are those elements which may form the basis of a complaint. They start at paragraph 6 in the Model Code of Conduct. So on that note, I'm going to go straight into the obligations and talk through them one by one. So one of the first issues to be discussed by the LGA was the notion of respect. Initially, they consulted upon concept of civility, found it very hard to define, and I think some commentators were responding to the consultation saying, well, we can be respectful, but sometimes political debate is not necessarily civil in nature. So they scrapped the concept of civility and went with respect. Of course, you'll be aware that there is currently an initiative in relation to town and parish councils where the notion of civility is being introduced as a sort of charter between councillors to treat each other respectfully and with civility. And the other thing, of course, which we do get complaints about, is that local authority employees, so your clerk and any other employees of your town and parish council, are also to be treated with respect. And just to go on to the next slide, so it is linked to disrepute, but where's the line drawn? So I wouldn't want anyone to think that you can't have robust debate in meetings. That is the nature of democracy. You are entitled to argue your point, fight your corner, whichever way you want to put it. But this is about politeness and courtesy in behaviour and speech and in the written word. As I say, having different views are all part of healthy democracy, and you can challenge, criticise, disagree with opinions, but in a respectful way. I think the line really is when a robust position turns to personal attack, and when we have that, then we have potential for breach of the code of conduct. In your contact with the public, you should also treat them politely and courteously, because rude and offensive behaviour lowers the public's expectations and confidence. However, it's a two-way street. You know, you are equally entitled to expect respectful behaviour from the public. And if the public are being abusive, intimidatory or threatening, you're entitled to withdraw yourself from any interaction with them. And of course, if it is of that nature, you could certainly report any behaviour to the police or the relevant social media provider. I think also what we need to be aware of is that it applies to fellow councillors, and that also extends to district councillors who attend your meetings as guests to update on what's happening at district council level and county council level. I've had some concerns raised to me by group leaders at the district councils that some members have faced some pretty stark treatment at certain parish council meetings. And I did undertake that I would just mention it in this training session, that again, the concept of respect applies in that situation as well. So bullying, harassment and discrimination, I think every one of us would recognise and know what this means. What the Committee for Standards in Public Life said is that they needed codes of conduct to have a definition of bullying and harassment. The model code now has that. The definition of bullying is taken from ACAS, so Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service. They characterise bullying as offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour, abuse or misuse of power through means that undermine, humiliate, denigrate or injure the recipient. In terms of harassment, the definition is taken from the Protection from Harassment Act, and it's conduct which causes alarm or distress and puts people in fear of violence. The legal test is it must be on 2 occasions to be a course of conduct. So what we always advise is that if contact from constituents starts to become something which is bordering on harassment, then clearly your council can take action. We will always give some advice in those circumstances. For district councillors, our legal department would write to the person, and at the far end of the scale could even bring proceedings for an injunction. So there are means available if if anybody is having behaviour directed at them which would constitute harassment. In terms of code of conduct complaints, bullying does tend to be something which comes across our desk. You'll see some cases on the handout which I put in some detail. One is Heesum, which was a Welsh case. Generally, in that case, the councillor was bullying members of staff, so officers, threatening them with their jobs. Essentially, over a period of time, I think he was found to have breached the code of conduct on about 7 occasions. And then finally here, promote equalities and not discriminate against any person. I think all of us now know the concept of protected characteristics under the Equality Act. We have a public sector equality duty to foster good relations and to ensure that there is no discrimination. We don't. I've only ever had one complaint that somebody has failed to promote equalities. It's quite a difficult one in terms of concept, because shall promote equalities is a positive act, but I take that really to mean that councillors will not treat anybody less favourably because of a protected characteristic. So that's the approach I would take to that. Impartiality of officers, so councillors shall not compromise or attempt to compromise the impartiality of anybody who works on behalf of the council. What does that mean? Well, at district council level, we have literally, hot off the press, just adopted a member officer relations protocol that sets out quite clearly what is expected. Now, at district council level, I know it's a bit different to town and parish council level. Probably more politics at district council level, different roles and responsibilities. But one of the things we wanted to make clear is that politicians set the strategic direction for the council officers, put that into effect, and generally it's about setting the scene that what roles and responsibilities are, to try to avoid blurring of lines, and I think fundamentally to avoid any issues arising in public meetings, for example. So if a councillor has a difficulty with a clerk or an employee of the council, that shouldn't be picked up in a public meeting. It should be dealt with through the chair or through the proper channels if you have a committee. As you know, the clerk, like an officer at district council level, works for the local authority as a whole and must be politically neutral. And they shouldn't be coerced or persuaded to act in a way that undermine their neutrality. I mean, we had a recent case where a relatively inexperienced parish councillor was insisting that a clerk change the minutes to include something that he wanted them to include, and that was after the minutes had actually been approved by the council. And the clerk did try to say that that wasn't appropriate, but the councillor wouldn't really take her word for it, and was, in my view, trying to coerce her to change the minutes to suit what he wanted to say. So that's just an example that it does tend to happen, even if it appears relatively benign on the surface. I think a more sinister example of that, probably Sandwell Borough Council, former councillor Hussein, again on the notes, but this was a councillor who regularly used to try to get officers to do things as he wanted them to include cancelling parking tickets for members of his family, and on one occasion he overruled officers to sell a piece of property to somebody he knew for a knockdown price. That was a very controversial code of conduct complaint. Very eminent QC chaired the committee, found 8 breaches of the code. The councillor is no longer a councillor, but believe it or not, this still rumbles on to this day. I think there have been lots of internal inquiries about it. Some find that the councillor perhaps was part of a campaign from a political perspective. Others have essentially upheld the code of conduct finding that quite simply this councillor acted with impunity and did put pressure on officers. So again, you know, you wouldn't believe it would happen, but it does. Sorry about this slide being very busy. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but this is about confidentiality and access to information. We do have access to information which may well be sensitive and not for public consumption. So this is intended to ensure that there's no breach of confidentiality. I put some comments on the notes in relation to the common law position. That arises from a case in Birmingham back in 1983, and it's called need to know. So councillors don't have a roving brief, as the court called it. Generally, you have a need. If you have a need to know to carry out your role, then you're entitled to see that information. Otherwise, not. In that case, that was a councillor who was trying to get information regarding a family who were under social services auspices. She wasn't on that particular committee, so not entitled to the information. I think the world has moved on a bit now, and certainly my approach has always been one of openness wherever possible. And generally speaking, at district council level, I take a view that councillors are generally entitled to anything that the council is dealing with as a matter of business, unless there's a good reason not to. So it's the exception rather than the rule. An extension to this is that you will come into information which you should not misuse. Does that happen? I'm afraid yes, it does. Recent case, Caerphilly County Borough Council, councillor there, David Poole. By virtue of his role as a cabinet member, he was involved in the Cardiff Capital Region and came to know about a company called IQE PLC, who were leasing a site from the Cardiff Capital Region. As a result of information gained that the company was on the up and up, he bought shares in that company and was found to have been in breach of the code and was suspended. I think he argued that he didn't have information. He essentially speculated on the shares, but it was found that but for the information he gained, he wouldn't have bought the shares. And in the end, he was suspended and he sold the shares at a loss. So, you know, he shouldn't have even been involved in that transaction. And again, I do struggle sometimes to understand how a councillor, having training like this, having the code of conduct, can think that that would be okay. Just don't really understand that, but there we are. It does happen. So disrepute is probably one of the widest of the obligations in the code of conduct, and it's a matter of judgment. You can either bring your office or the local authority into disrepute. As I say, it's capable of very wide interpretation, application, and most cases have this as an aspect. One of the things I point out is decision-making process is pertinent here, and particularly around interests, because public perception about the integrity of our decision-making process is key. Now, you may take a view as town and parish councils that the likelihood of challenge is probably quite small, and I think that's probably correct. But there are a number of judicial review cases where town and parish councils have been challenged on their decisions. You know, you take very important decisions, and some of them may well be controversial in the area. I suppose neighbourhood plans can cause quite a bit of consternation and factionalize communities. So, you know, if there's anything in terms of a neighbourhood plan decision-making process which was open to question, then a judicial review could result. So I just raise that as an example. I'll put some cases on the slides The one I always refer to is one which still sort of staggers me all these years on, was a former leader of the City and County of Swansea, Lawrence Bailey. He was disqualified for 2.5 years. He had a laptop computer which was given to him by the council. He put it in for repair, and the IT boards found that he had pornographic material on there. I stress that it was legal pornographic material, but nevertheless on a council laptop. But I suppose if there is a humorous edge to this story, they also found that he had about 250 documents on his hard drive, all of which were letters written under assumed names to the local newspaper saying what a wonderful job Councillor Bailey was doing for his community. So yeah, 2.5 years. The irony of him now being a columnist for the same newspaper is not lost on me, I hasten to add. He writes a weekly column as a consultant. So there we are. So just be careful that your actions may have an adverse effect on the council. As I said earlier on, your private actions would not be caught by the code of conduct, but still reflect on you as a councillor. So use of position, you shouldn't use your position to your advantage or disadvantage to anyone else. There have been some cases where councillors have been alleged to have had a personal animosity towards somebody and taken part in a decision. Well, quite clearly, interests aside, if you are not able to put your personal views to one side, you shouldn't really be taking part in that decision making process. And obviously I've given you the example of Councillor Poole at Caerphilly Borough Council and his shareholding as an example of this. Another example I would give is that of Councillor Kevin O'Neill, who was the former leader of Merthyr Tydfil Borough Council. Classic case of NIMBYism. He became aware that the house next door to him was going to be sold to a company who operated care facilities for youngsters in care. There was a local outcry about it, concerted media, social media campaign. Essentially, they didn't want this company to be located in their community, and Councillor O'Neill was incensed on the basis that it was going to be right next door to him. So there was a meeting between social services and the company to discuss the issue. Councillor O'Neill, as leader, wanted to take part. The monitoring officer said, no, you should not take part. You clearly conflicted. Nevertheless, he said, well, I'm just going to listen. I'm not going to take part in the meeting. He couldn't help himself. He did start to sort of question the company and ended up really sort of chairing the meeting in effect. So he was reported, found to be in breach and suspended. In the event, the company didn't actually buy the property, but a classic example here of being involved in something which you should be nowhere near, in my view. So use of resources, you can only use council resources to enable you to do your job. So general support to assist you in carrying out your duties, so office support, stationery, equipment, those sorts of things. Access and use of local authority buildings and rooms as part of your, perhaps if you're a member of a political group, that's absolutely fine, that's not a problem. But what you're not allowed to do is to misuse facilities. I've only ever had one complaint around this particular aspect of the code of conduct, and that was when I was in Swansea. And obviously with elections around the corner, this is quite topical, but I think it was the Lib Dem group brought a machine called a risograph into the council buildings. I had no idea what this was, but apparently it's something which can churn out leaflets at a rate of knots. and they'd brought it into the building. And they plugged it in and they were generating leaflets. Of course, you know, that was for political purposes. They shouldn't have been doing that. In the end, I think we came up with a way to resolve it by charging them for any electricity they used and for any paper that they used. But fundamentally, you're not allowed to use council resources for political purposes, even with a small p. So this is quite a new introduction to the Code of Conduct. Really, it's about compliance to the code. That speaks for itself. You shall undertake Code of Conduct training as required by the local authorities. So that'd be your council. So tick in the box, you've done it. Well done. We will be running some more training sessions after the next elections, but clearly we will. The approach I take is that if I'd rather members attend the trainings. You can ask any questions that you want, but if you can demonstrate to your clerk that you've watched the recording, then as far as I'm concerned, that's fine by me. So there are also some elements about cooperating with the Code of Conduct investigation outcome and not to get involved with any witnesses. Okay, so going to focus now for the last part of the meeting on interests. So there's always been a problem area in public life between interests and the potential conflict between your private interest and the public duty. Essentially, we are here to serve the public, not to serve our private interests. That's fundamentally what this is all about. You know that the Localism Act requires me to establish and maintain a register of interests. I do that. Your clerks will send them to us and we publish them online. So this is something which I think caused me a lot of concern when I first arrived. There was an over focus, in my view, on disclosable pecuniary interests, and not much attention was being paid to actual conflicts of interest, perhaps, which were not of a monetary nature. So I was quite glad to see the Code of Conduct change. The biggest uncertainty, I think, amongst members is everybody, I think, will accept, well, if I've got a financial interest in the outcome, then I shouldn't be taking part. Everybody seems to know that. But there did seem to be quite a lot of confusion as to non-financial interests. And I'll talk through that in a moment. And the purpose of you registering your interest quite clearly is that the public and local authority employees and fellow councillors know of your interests. It's about openness and transparency and making sure that you are putting out there any interest that you may have. You are personally responsible for deciding whether or not you should disclose an interest. Only you can know whether you have an interest or not. We can, or your clerk can advise. And, you know, we are always happy to advise on a code of conduct on a preventative basis. I'd much rather give 10 minutes of my time to talk you through an issue than spend perhaps a full day dealing with a code of conduct complaint. But as I say, only you know whether you've got an interest, and clearly declarations make sure that everything is above board. We'll talk through what happens when you've got an interest over the next few slides. One of the things I'm quite keen on is making sure, where possible, that you take part in the debate if you are entitled to be there. So you see, I've mentioned the case there of Ware versus Neath Talbot Borough Council. That's in the notes. There was a mantra there amongst some members, which was, if in doubt, get out. And the court said that's taking it too far. You have to look at the situation before you decide whether you can properly take part. So openness and transparency on personal interests as a guide, that's included in the pack. It's a government document, which is probably 2013, I think, but still very good now in terms of guidance. So that's also something that we can send out to you. Okay, so let's get into them. So now 3 categories of interests broken down as follows. So you have disclosable pecuniary interests. I think everybody knows what they are. In the past, I've basically flashed a table on the slide deck and whiz through it. Tonight I'm just going to go through each element so that we are in no doubt as to what it means and whether it applies to you and when. We also have a new concept now called other registerable interests. In the past, on the register of interest form, we have, as a voluntary measure, registered perhaps the fact that one is a county councillor or one is a town or parish councillor. Now that is a formal requirement. And then we have the catch-all at the end called non-registerable interests. Those of you who have been councillors for some time may well remember the old money, as I call it, personal and prejudicial interests. So that is almost back to the future on that. So I'll talk through that, break it down for you in a moment. So straight away then, disclosable pecuniary interests. They're set out in regulations. They are very clearly expressed. What they mean is that it's an interest of yourself or your partner if you're aware of your partner's interest. The descriptions that I'll go through in a moment. Partner, as you can see there, means spouse or civil partner, or a person with whom you're living as husband and wife, or a person with whom you're living as civil partner. So anybody close to you in that respect. You must ensure that your register of interest is kept up to date. There seems to be a misconception that you only have to do it after an election. Well, if you stay in the same house and you don't change jobs, absolutely fine. But any changes have to be notified within 28 days. Failure to do so is in itself potentially an offence. I'm not trying to use scare tactics there. It is a criminal offence not to declare your interests, your disclosable pecuniary interests. There's only ever been one prosecution. Committee for Standards in Public Life said, well, we don't really need this. Government disagreed. So it's still a criminal offence to fail to disclose. But it must relate. So essentially, in terms of examples, the issue which you're considering must relate to your DPI. So an example from the guidance the LGA put together. So if you have registered 1 Acacia Avenue as your address, you would have a DPI if you put in a planning application for number 1 Acacia Avenue, or if the whole of Acacia Avenue was being considered for a resident parking zone. So that directly relates to your DPI. But you wouldn't have a DPI if number 3 Acacia Avenue were put in a planning application, as the matter does not directly relate to your registered interest. But in those circumstances, you may well have a non-registerable interest, as the application may indirectly affect your property. And I had an issue before with a parish councillor who would put in an objection to a planning application by a neighbour, specifically said in the objection that it would interfere with the use and enjoyment of his garden, but then wanted to take part in a consideration of that planning application at his parish council. We did have a very lengthy conversation trying to explain why that wasn't appropriate. That was in the absence of formulated interest that we have now in the Code of Conduct. So it's beyond doubt now as far as I'm concerned. So these are the categories. Employment, any office, trade, profession or vocation means you must disclose with anything carried on for profit or gain. Doesn't cover voluntary work, doesn't cover you as a retired professional or retired person. So you wouldn't have to declare that. It's just anything which is current for which you get paid. But some of these are a bit confusing because some have just applied to the area which your council is situated, and others apply anywhere. So employment anywhere, you have to declare that. Sponsorship, generally in relation to political campaigning, sponsorship, etc., and membership of trade unions. Not such a big issue at parish council level, but something you need to be aware of. Contracts, so any contract between the relevant person, i.e. the councillor, or a company or partnership that the council has an interest in, and the relevant authority. so it relates to goods and services. So generally speaking, if you have a company which perhaps provide, I don't know, grass cutting services to the parish council, you shouldn't be involved in any decisions or discussions around that if the contract was being discussed, for example. I say there, which has not been fully discharged, i.e. the contract is still live. Once the contract is discharged, then clearly it's a matter of degree. It may well be a non-registrable interest at that point. Land applies to all of us. We all live somewhere, but it's for you as town and parish councillors, it's only within the area of your relevant authority. So you only have to declare that if it's within that area. It includes any land ownership, no matter how small, or if in joint names, your home and any investment property. So you have to disclose that. I'll talk a bit about sensitive interests now rather than later on. There's a slide in it. Given some of the horrific issues that have happened with national politicians, MPs, the government have taken a view that in terms of election nomination forms, you don't have to put your personal address. Unfortunately, the Code of Conduct is not caught up with that. So guidance was issued some time ago that if you're in fear of violence or intimidation, you can ask the monitoring officer to agree that you have a sensitive interest. So I'll say quite clearly, I have never refused one. As far as I'm concerned, if you are sufficiently concerned enough to ask, then I would have no difficulty in agreeing. On the register, then it would say I have an interest which I've disclosed to the monitoring officer. And of course, if you have any issues which affected your property, you wouldn't have to disclose your address. You would just say I have an interest which I've disclosed. So if there's any concern about that, all you need to do is to either drop me a line directly or ask your clerk to contact us, and it'll be a formality as far as I'm concerned. It can apply to employment. When I was working in Gloucestershire, quite clearly GCHQ in Cheltenham, some councillors were employed there. Quite clearly it was appropriate there to register that as a sensitive interest, but employment probably less so than somebody's house. Licenses, I wanted to make it clear that it's any land in the area of your relevant authority for a month or longer. So it wouldn't include hiring the village hall for an event, even if up to a week. So if you were hiring, as I say, the village hall for perhaps an Amdram production or something like that, that would be fine. It's anything for a month or longer. I say quite clearly that includes allotments. You may or may not be surprised at the amount of complaints generated around allotments and discussions thereof at parish council level. So if you have an allotment with your council, it is a disclosable pecuniary interest, and you need to register it. I'm going to fly through these next couple of slides, and time is getting on. So corporate tenancies, so shops, etc. If you have any, if your council owns any commercial property which is let and the councillor is a tenant, then of course that would be a DPI. Securities, that's something which is a bit of an enigma wrapped up in a mystery. Essentially, you have to have shares in a body which has a place of interest in your council's area. So probably not going to apply much to parish councils. So some shares in BT, whatever, wouldn't really matter. You wouldn't have to declare those because has to be 25,000 or 100th of the total issued share capital of that company. One thing which caught a couple of councillors out has been community interest companies, because generally they're £3 worth of shares with £1 each. Well, of course, even though it's a not-for-profit organisation and the shareholding is quite small, you then have a controlling influence in that company, so you would have to declare that. Sensitive interests I've mentioned, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. Okay, so if you've got a DPI, what must you do? Well, unless a dispensation has been granted, you may not participate in any discussion or vote, and you must withdraw from the room or the chamber when the meeting discusses and votes on the matter. That's quite clear. So unless you've got a dispensation, you must not take part. Okay, all very straightforward. Afraid that's going to change slightly now with the new interest that we've got. So other registrable interests. So you will have a personal interest in any business of your authority where it relates to or is likely to affect. And as you can see, those are the categories there. In terms of unpaid directorships, quite clearly speaks for itself. A body in which you have general control or management, which you are nominated to or appointed by your authority, probably less likely to apply to you as town and parish councils. This will apply though anybody exercising functions of a public nature. So school governors, for example, would be caught by that. Body directed at charitable purposes. So it depends whether you're on perhaps a board of a charity operating in the area. And the last one, as you can see, is public opinion. So the criteria is that you are a member of that organisation or in a position of general control or management. So quite clearly, as a school governor, you are in a position of general control or management. So that's the first part you have to consider. So if something comes across the council desk, which is in relation to that body which you have an interest, then you have to declare, and then you have to think about, well, what is actually taking place here. So it's different to a DPI because it's not just financial and personal to you. It must be linked to the financial interest or well-being of that organization or entity. So if let's say, for argument's sake, you are a school governor and the school governor are applying to your council for a grant, for example. Quite clearly there's a financial interest involved, so the other interest would be engaged. You must declare at the meeting, either the declaration stage or perhaps sometimes the debate goes a certain way and you realise that you have an interest, you declare it then at that point. So in terms of what you can do, well, you can speak on the matter if members of the public are entitled to, but you mustn't take part in any discussion or vote in the matter unless you've been granted dispensation. So that's the situation of other interests. What does well-being mean? Well, I've put a slide in which was formulated by the then Standards Board. As you can see there, it's very widely drawn. Just to give an example, I had a situation in Swansea many years ago where there was a governor panel and one of the councillors' husband had put himself forward, and she took part in that, in his nomination as a governor, and was found to be in breach of the code of conduct on the basis that her well-being would have been enhanced by making sure that her husband was appointed as a governor. So that's a real example of that applying. So non-registrable interests. I said earlier on, personal and prejudicial interests, that's as close as we've got to going back to that. So a non-registrable interest, you haven't got to register it as a matter of course. It's generally going to crop up depending on an item of business which is on your agenda. It must be something which directly affects your financial interest or well-being, which is not DPI or other registrable interest, or the financial interest or well-being of a relative or close associate. So, for example, again from the guidance, under A, your own financial interest or well-being, if your son has submitted an application for a license to open a bar, the matter directly relates to your relative. You wouldn't be able to take part in any discussion or vote in the matter. Excuse me. Under B, for example, an application has been made to build several units of housing on a field adjacent to your business partner's home. It's not their application, but they will be more affected by the application than the majority of people. So again, you wouldn't be allowed to take part. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier on, an application for a property next door to you doesn't directly relate to your property, so it's not a DPI, but you would need to declare a non-registrable interest. And you recall the example I gave earlier of the councillor who objected to the planning application on the property next door to him. Again, as I said earlier on, co-option of a relative onto a councillor will be covered by A and B. And planning permission for land next to a school of which you're a governor could be called. So say traffic would be greatly increased. So this is a bit more convoluted. So if you have, so essentially you've established that you have an interest in that matter. Whether you can remain and vote on the item depends then on the following. So whether your financial interest or well-being is affected to a greater extent than the rest of the people in your area. And then secondly, whether a reasonable member of the public, importantly, knowing all the facts, would believe that it would affect your view of the wider public interest. So in Wales, we've still got personal and prejudicial interest. So this is the prejudice from a public perspective. If you are not able or not perceived to be able to take a decision in the public interest, then you should not take part. You can speak if a member of the public is allowed, but other than that, unless you've got a dispensation, you must not remain in the room. So we've asked everybody to Chris McCarthy. You got your hand up?
Yes, I have. Both on the last slide and slide 34, I'm a little bit confused because it does say that you can discuss, you may speak on the matter only if members of the public are also allowed to speak on the matter.
Yeah.
On the meeting. It says otherwise you must take no part in the meeting, discussion and vote on the matter, and you must be out of the room. I don't understand, if you're allowed to talk, why does it say you've got to be out of the room?
Once you've spoken, so you shouldn't be in the room.
Well, then that needs to go on the slide, and you haven't said that. That's what I couldn't understand. So you're saying you can speak on it, but then when the discussion about the vote and the vote goes on, you've got to leave the room.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that doesn't come across in there, and it didn't on slide 34. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for pointing that out. I'll amend it.
The way it reads is you can talk, and then it says, but you shouldn't be in the room. So it didn't quite make sense.
Yeah, no, yeah, sorry. Yeah, counterintuitive. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. So just to be clear, if the public are entitled to be there to speak, you can speak, but then you must leave the meeting. The rationale for that is that your presence could influence councillors in terms of their voting. So if you're not in the room, then there's less chance of that. But thanks very much for pointing that out.
Patrick, you got Catherine Keats.
Catherine Keats, yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to point out, I don't know what the reason is, I can't see any slides and haven't since we started.
Oh, right, okay.
So,
oh, sorry about that. I think I did check before we started with Stephen that they were visible.
I was a couple of minutes late.
What sometimes happens, obviously don't do it now, but sometimes you have to leave the meeting and come back in, and it'll be there. One of the vagaries of Teams, I'm afraid. But we will be sending them out, so you'll have them as a companion set for posterity.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we have asked you to complete new register of interest forms. After the next elections, we'll have to do it again. This will be a one-off. We appreciate it's a bit of a pain because you might have only recently done it. But because we have this new interest regime, we do require you to register. So A.G. McKeith, is it?
Yeah, that's me. Hello. There's a question on the chat that I think it would be helpful if you could answer.
Yeah, I did say I'm not very good at multitasking. Let's have a look.
I'll read it out if you like, Patrick.
So in the House of Commons, you can't call someone a liar. Is this the case in the council? Can one councillor accuse another of lying, or is that a breach of the code? Slightly different rules between us and Parliament, because you've got parliamentary privilege. But there are certain conventions, i.e. you shouldn't call somebody a liar. I would say that that would be caught by respect. Unless you've got proof to show that somebody is not telling the truth, you should not call somebody a liar because of, apart from anything else, it's defamatory. So essentially, don't do it. If you have direct evidence that somebody has said something which is misleading council, I would suggest you make a complaint under the Code of Conduct, because that would be a disrepute issue. Okay, so dispensations. I think there's been some confusion around this. That I did have a colleague clerk contact me to say we'd always understood that there's the monitoring officer that granted dispensations. The legislation is quite clear. It's the proper officer of the authority, so it's for the clerk to grant dispensations. Excuse me. There are criteria which apply, and they're set out on the slide. Essentially, if basically without the dispensation you couldn't actually deal with the business. Political groups, probably not so applicable to you. The grant of the dispensation is the interests of people living in the district or your area. So it'll be a matter of degree. I can't remember the last time I was actually asked for and granted a dispensation, if I'm honest. In fact, it was during a meeting where a councillor was speaking when he wasn't entitled to, so I had to deal with the dispensation on the hoof, so to speak. Generally, what you do is you would consider the business and speak to the clerk. So a dispensation will entitle you to either participate in a discussion on a matter for a DPI. Obviously, you are entitled to comment on other interests and non-registrable interests. And as I say, the criteria are there. So in terms of tips, really, questions you need to ask yourself with regard to interests. There's a flow chart that we're going to send out, and I have to say it is really useful to follow through the process just to decide whether you've got an interest or not. But some of the easiest thing to remember, really, have you got a stake or of any kind in the outcome of a matter in discussion? You know, are you going to be affected by it? If you have an interest or conflict, what should you do? One, speak to the clerk. Having said that, you can always contact Stephen or myself to have a chat about it. We're always happy to help. Would an objective third party, knowing all the facts, think that you couldn't possibly take an interest in take a decision in the public interest? I often say, how would it look on the front page of the local newspaper if you took part in something in which you had an interest? If you think that your judgment might be affected, what do I do? Well, again, you speak to the clerk before the item of business for the meeting, effectively, and decide the best way to deal with it. As I said earlier on, only you can declare, and it's your decision to do so. Advice from your clerk will be mitigation, not exoneration. So if you didn't declare an interest or took part and took part in the meeting without having declared that interest, then if you'd taken advice and, for argument's sake, were told that you were fine, then you could still be in breach of the code. So you know whether you've got an interest or not. It's a personal matter for you to decide. I always say take advice before the meeting. There's nothing worse, really, as monitoring officer being asked in a meeting when you have to get the facts from the councillor in a public meeting and then take a view. I had an issue at Stroud where we were dealing with a local plan, very controversial, during Purda. So we were proceeding with it because we had to. And there was a particular site which was quite contentious, a candidate site. And 5 minutes before the meeting started, I had a call from a panicked councillor to say, just had an email from a reporter with private eye. And I said, oh, right, okay. So she sent it over to me. This is now 5 minutes before a very important meeting. So I'd already spoken to her about her DPIs because her husband had a business which is right on the corner of this candidate site, and they were quite clear that they weren't affected one way or the other. So she didn't believe that she had an interest. The private eye reporter said to her, "Have you forgotten that your husband's company pays your husband and yourself £75,000 a year for rent for this particular site?" So that point, I had to say to her, "Well, you should have declared that." Well, I didn't know how to. I said, "Well, obviously you should have declared it, and you now can't take part in the meeting." But as I say, I was on the hop with that one. She hadn't appreciated that it was an interest. I'm not really sure why, but quite clearly, if you can think about these things when the agenda comes out and speak to your clerk, it just gives you both that opportunity to discuss it in a non-pressured environment. Just remember, as I said earlier on, that a breach of the code of conduct in terms of interest could also be a reputational issue for your council and disrepute. And you know, if councillors are taking part in matters in which they have an interest, well, quite clearly it can damage public trust in the organisation and the entity. As I said earlier on, I'm very happy to give time on what I call a lost leader basis to give advice rather than spend a lot of time and resources dealing with complaints later on. So who is that? That's Sue Hendry. Sorry, seems to be the phrase of the century now. You're on mute.
Right, can you hear me now?
I can.
Good, good. Right, just going back to some of the earlier things you were talking about, if you find that a councillor has brought his or her council into disrepute or has embarrassed the council or is being bullying, what can you personally as the monitoring officer do about that?
Okay, really good question. The last session I ran, I did a slide on sanctions. I hadn't this time because of the timing. So quite frankly, the code of conduct regime that we have now is pretty toothless in terms of sanctions. Really speaking, all that is available is to censure the councillor, and that's generally published. You can prevent that councillor from having access to particular staff. So if there's a bullying issue, you can prevent that councillor from having direct contact with that person. If they're involved in outside bodies, you can take them off those outside bodies. What you can't do is prevent them coming to council meetings, because quite clearly, as a councillor, they're summoned to attend and they're entitled to attend. So not a great deal, I'm afraid to say. The rationale the government have is that councillors will be judged at the ballot box. I had quite an embarrassing conversation with a former civil servant. I was having a bit of a moan about the inadequacies of the system as I saw it, and he then told me that he was involved in drafting the legislation which led to it. But quite clearly their view was that councillors should be judged at the ballot box. And I said, well, they may do something in the first 3 or 4 months of their role as a councillor. Who's going to remember that 4 years later? And we also know that not all seats are contested at town and parish council level. So generally, my view is that that's a pretty poor way to deal with poor behaviour. The Committee for Standards in Public Life recommended a sanction of suspension up to 6 months, but the government held the line, as I've just said, and decided they weren't going to agree with that. So we are where we are. We haven't got power to suspend. Generally, the sanctions are I've set out.
I see. Thank you for that. If a councillor was deliberately ignorant of the code of conduct, could they actually still be held liable under any of these codes?
Yeah, it binds you as a councillor when you're acting in your capacity as a councillor, or if you give the impression. So, ignorance or not, you are still bound by the code of conduct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. There are a couple of slides on gifts and hospitality, which I'm not going to go through now because the time ends. They speak for themselves. So, just some parting comments, really. Consider your interests now and always update them as things change. That way, then you can never be accused of failing to declare, because everything is above board. Remember, openness and transparency are key. Sorry, stating the obvious, but read your papers carefully and try to anticipate any decisions or matters which could involve an interest. Seek advice as soon as possible if you're not sure. That's what we're here for. Only you can know whether you've got an interest, but you know, we want you to be taking part in decisions and business of your councils where appropriate. So err on the side of caution without being overcautious, is my advice. So that's the end of the presentation. More than happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Okay, well, I'd just like to finish then by thanking you all very much for your kind attention and for attending this evening. And I hope you have a very nice evening, what remains of it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.